I'm Eric, engineering manager here at Koali for the curriculum and catalog products. Happy to have you all here joining us for this session. This session is going to feature a fairly deep dive into the APIs that we have available within curriculum management, and we're going to be talking through some of the CRUD operations available: create, read, update, delete, that you can do, of course, within the interface, and then how you would do those things within the API. And then we'll go through some examples for some different use cases, and then we will talk through the catalog embed process, which will just be a smaller section at the end. So here's the outline of the presentation. We're going to cover configuration and schema and how the configuration informs the schema, and then we're going to go into pretty deep dive into some of the CRUD operations that you can do with the API. Then we're going to take a 5-10 minute break here in between this section and before going through the examples. Just if people need to grab water, go use the bathroom or something, we can do that. And then we're going to go through the catalog embed. Get started here. So the first thing that we're going to need is our instance of Koali Curriculum Management. So this could be your own instance, at your sandbox instance that you're using, for example, at your campus. I'm using this particular instance that I was just demoing in the last one. And then you're also going to need an API key. Navigating over into the users section, which you can click on here. If you click into the users section, that's going to take you to a list of users. And you have your own user account. Most of you will be admins. And so one thing to be aware of with your API key is, because it's tied to your user account, it's going to have the same capabilities as if you were logged into the system. So in many cases, you may want to have an API key that just acts like a normal user. So we can create an API key by navigating over to the API key section, and then I can go ahead and create a key, and then that will show you this key, which will give it to you one time, and I've tied it to this demo standard user account. So once you have your key, you're going to need to copy and paste it, and then you can use it. But after you navigate away from this screen, you're not going to be able to retrieve it anymore. It's encrypted in our database, and so you'd have to create a new key if you happen to lose the key. But for anybody that wants to follow along, certainly not a requirement. I'm going to post into the chat here. Let's see. I'm going to post this API key. Everyone in the meeting, there we go. So if you'd like to follow along, you certainly can, but it's, like I said, it's not a requirement, and you can use this API key to make sample API key calls during the presentation if you'd like. Otherwise, like I said, you don't have to.
Eric, may I ask
Yes.
a question? Now that Koali CM and Koali build have kind of split to separate URLs, will this API key for your user account on CM be different than your API key for your user account on build?
Yeah, it will. It would be different. Mm-hmm. Yep. Good question. So yeah, we've got our API key. And then the last thing that we need is a REST client. So there's a lot of different really great REST clients out there. I typically use Insomnia, which is a nice lightweight client that I think is available for all platforms, all major platforms, operating systems. Postman is another very powerful, very popular API, REST API client. And then there are plenty of other standalone applications. Some people really like using the command line. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to use a browser extension so it's easy to navigate in between on my screen share here. I happen to be using this Chrome extension called Rester, and I've got a number of different API calls associated with that configuration there. So the other thing that I want to highlight before we go any further, and many of you are already familiar with this, but our API documentation is available at developers.quali.co. And this is pretty thoroughly documented. But one thing that I'm hoping that we can do in this presentation is bridge some of the understanding with some of the abstraction that happens in this documentation, given how it's structured, and talk about some real world use case scenarios. So as we're going along, if you get ideas of certain things that you might like to think about using the API for, I'm all ears and happy to talk about those things. So, okay. Any questions on setting up now or in the future? Yeah, just let me know. Okay. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about configuration and schema here. So as I mentioned in the previous presentation, if you were there, our software is highly configurable, and no two instances look alike. And that's very intentional. We want the system to be configurable to match your particular institution's needs. So we know the system needs to be flexible because we've got all these different types of needs. We know it needs to be dynamic to adapt to different types of scenarios for different types of audiences. We know it needs to be institution specific because everybody uses their own nomenclature and has forms that they're coming from that they're familiar with. But that kind of flexibility can understandably result in some confusion sometimes. And you might be saying, but wait, the dynamic schema means that the schema is not static, and that's true. As you're adding fields, the schema for a particular type of content can change over time. And so that's, like I said, that's very intentional. We want the system to be able to adapt to not only individual institution needs, but we want the system to be able to adapt to emerging needs as new data needs are identified. So we're going to go into the portion of the presentation to go over configuration and how that influences the schema. So if I go into curriculum management here, and I'm looking at a course, I'm going to go ahead and move my window over here. And if I create a course in my particular instance, you'll see all of these fields here. So all of these fields are going to represent data points within the schema for a course object as the form is configured right now. And so we've got, just as an example, we've got our proposal rationale, our effective catalog year, the prefix, number, department, and so on, all the way down through the form. So each of these is going to have a key within the schema. So just scrolling down there, you can see the range of different types of fields. And as you might imagine, the data for these different types of fields is going to look very different depending on the different fields. So if I go into my course schema endpoint, so I'm just going to click over into my REST API client here. And I want to talk through this schema endpoint. So in this case, we've got, I'm going to go ahead and grab the courses schema, and it's a GET request. And I've already set it up to include my API key token. So I can go ahead and make this call. So if I go ahead and issue this call, this API, REST API client will give me all of the header response information. And then down here in the body, you can start to see the schema for my, my course form, essentially. So as I go back over here, just to reference, we've got the proposal rationale here and the effective catalog year supporting documentation. And then if I click back over here, you can see we've got proposal rationale, and that label is represented here. So this is going to be my key for each of the different data points in the system. Same thing with date start. And I've got my descriptive text and my label there. You can see I have a mandatory for submission flag. So you can see all of the settings in the schema there. And that's going to go all the way down through all of the different types of fields. And one thing that I want to sort of plant the seed on right now is that certain types of fields Noah, the research APIs would be different, but they do have similar APIs available. So the endpoints would be a little bit different, to answer your question. So one thing I want to just highlight and plant the seed on right now is that certain types of fields, for example, if I scroll down here and we can look at number, you can see that this is a text field, so I can enter in text, and that text is just going to be stored on the record itself. And we'll get into how that looks in the API response a little bit later. Same thing with, for example, like the title field here. So this is another text field. And then let's say description is a text area field. So all of those types of fields, clicking back over into my schema here, this number field, for example, the course title here is my title, for example, and I can do a 101 there. All of that data is going to be stored directly on the record in the text format there. So you don't need to do anything else when you're capturing that data. Here is my description. If you're wanting to make an API call to extract this data, you can read that right directly from the response. However, going back to my schema API call here, scrolling back up, you can see subject code is an example of what we call an options field. In this case, it's an options type ahead field. And so the data for subject code is actually going to be referencing an option type ID, which we can harvest that information by hitting a separate options endpoint. And I'll go through that in greater detail in a little bit. The same thing would be true for groups type field. So we have a groups type ahead field, for example, here. And those are going to require you, if you're harvesting the data and you're wanting to look up the name of that group, it's going to require you to hit a specific endpoint there. So if you wanted to get all of the schema for courses, you can simply make this schema endpoint call here and then retrieve that. And then you can also, clicking into this one, if I go ahead and issue this request, you can see I'm only getting the schema for this group filter 1 field. And so that's just going to give you a much smaller payload. If that's the only field you care about and you know that's the field you need, you can certainly do that. I could change this to subject code as well. And then that will give me the subject code schema for just that field. So if you want to minimize the amount of data that comes through on your payload, or how you're parsing it or whatever, you can certainly do that. All right, any questions on the schema side of things thus far?
I had a question.
Sure.
How could we detect changes? Let's say we're, downstream, we're running reports on these, some fields, and we want to know if someone removed a field, they pulled the rug out from under us. So could we detect that a field was removed, for example?
So the schema and the form configuration is essentially versionless. It's live as you're making the changes. So you would need to have a previous record to change that. There is a updated timestamp associated with the schema to be able to see when it was last updated. But the other thing to keep in mind about schema changes, if somebody changed a field or removed a field, is that does not change any of the data for the affected courses, for example. It's just the form schema. So you may have data points that were previous, like legacy data points, available on the records. Now, an administrator may choose to remove those data points if you're trying to do some sort of cleanup or something like that. But typically that would be part of the change management process at your institution, both for adding and subtracting fields. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Any other questions before we move on from the form schema? Okay. All right. So we're going to get into what is the meat of the curriculum management APIs, at least. Next, we're going to talk about curriculum CRUD, which just tickles me to say in a presentation. So when we talk about curriculum in terms of curriculum management, this is these are the 5 different content types that we're talking about managing. So courses, programs, specializations, experiences, and policies. Of course, these are content that can be renamed within the system. However, the name change within the system, if I happen to say change specializations to emphases or something like that, is not going to affect the API endpoint that I'm hitting in order to retrieve this data. So one thing to note just right out of the gate is that it's essentially one endpoint. And this is something that sometimes people get a little confused on with when they're looking at the developer documentation. So I just want to click over to that and drive this point home. So we've got in the CM courses, programs, experiences, and so on section, at the beginning here, it talks about replacing all of our example URLs are done for the courses endpoints. But if you're needing to grab program information or experiences or specializations and so on, you can do that by simply replacing that URL there. So going back to my slides, it's one endpoint, sort of. We've got, here's what the endpoint looks like. So that would be true for courses, programs, specializations. You get the idea. Okay, so we're going to go through and talk about all the different types of operations available to you with the API, using that REST API client, and then also just navigating back into the interface to hopefully connect the dots on what we're doing there. So I'm going to click back over into my REST API client, and I'm going to go ahead and actually find this same course in here. So we're going to do Chem 221. And so here's this particular record. Again, we're of course storing all of this data within the system. And like I mentioned earlier, this data is going to be, it's going to look a little bit different depending on exactly what kind of field it is. So what I need in order to be able to grab this particular record is the ID of this record. So I've got that already populated here in my get course call. So we've got the course's endpoint, and then I'm going to go ahead and add that ID. And if I send this on through, you're going to see, again, all of the different data points associated with this record. So we've got our key, and then the value. So abbreviated course title is inorganic chemistry. Activities hours, you can see this is an array of objects because that represents a table type of data. We've got our credits field just as an example. This is how the credits data looks like. And it's even going to look a little bit different if I say have a range credit field, and I'll show you that a little bit later as well. Subject code, just scrolling down a little bit further. So we've got our subject code. Again, this is referencing that option type here, that option type ID. And then, here's the title, again, just stored in plain text. And then I wanted to show the group field. So we've got group filter 1, again, another ID. So if you want to know the name of this, you're going to have to query the groups endpoint as well. And that's going to correspond in this case to department and college. So I'll go ahead and go over here. We've got department that has that key of group filter 1, and college has the key of group filter 2. Again, clicking back into my schema here, just to connect the dots here, we've got group filter 1, again, named department, group filter 2, named college. Okay. So clicking back in here, again, I can see all of this different data here. And if I wanted to, for example, know the subject code name, then I'm going to need to hit the options API. So the options API is going to allow you to query all different types of options. And within the system, there are as many options as you might want to make for your forms. So I want to talk a little bit about the options side of things. So from the system settings area, I've got option types here. And within my option types, this is what we call our custom option types. And this is generally the most used piece of options administration. Excuse me. And so this is where I'm able to select all different types of options to be able to use within different types of options fields. So if I want to find the grading options, for example, excuse me, let me go back to options here. I've got my grading. I'll look at a different option type. So we'll look at this grade type here. So here's some different grade types that I have available. And then if these grade types are in use in a particular field, they're going to store a corresponding ID with a particular option. The same is true for subject codes. So each of the subject codes is going to have a name and a description. Optionally, it can be configured to link to a particular group as well. Some institutions do and don't do that. It just depends on how you have your particular instance configured. But the point being that the system can store a whole lot of different types of options within the system here. However, on the API side of things, if you know that from your schema, for example, that a particular field is an options type field, again, I'll go back to my schema call here. I'm just going down here. I know that this is an options field because it's an options type ahead field. And in my schema, I know that it's referencing a subject code option type, but I don't necessarily need to know what option type it's making reference to in order to be able to get the data for my course proposal here. So if I go into my Chem 221 and I grab my subject code ID, I only need to make an one endpoint call to this options endpoint with this ID. And the ID is going to be unique across all different types of options. So I don't necessarily need to know it's a subject code. That could be handy for other reasons, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But if I just simply make this call with the ID here, I can do that. And then it's going to return the name and the description and the linked group if I have a linked group set up. And so I can use that then to know the text value for these different types of fields that are referencing normalized data through the options type interface. So that's typically going to be the process if you're retrieving an individual record, or if you're manipulating an individual record, you're going to want to go ahead and make an individual call for an option type. But that's not always ideal if you're doing like a bulk data load or a bulk data extraction or something like that. And so we also can retrieve options by type here. So in this case, we've got this sample endpoint here, API CM options types, and then you specify the type there. And so, and then I'm limiting my results to 10. It is a paginated API call. So if I send this off, that's now going to return 10 options that are in this type. And if I wanted to view the next page, I simply pass in the skip equals 10, and then that's going to deliver the next 10. So I can go through that until I've gotten all of them. You can see in the header here that there are 77 total. So I would need to hit this API endpoint 8 times if I think I did the math right there, 8 times if I was going to get all of the options. And so we typically follow this process if we're doing bulk operations where we're processing, say, thousands of records, and we don't want to make an individual options call every single time. There's lots of duplicated calls that way. But we can do, say, a data load or a data extraction and loop through all of the option type data that we might need ahead of time and store that in a cache, and then reference that throughout as we're loading the data or extracting the data and so on. I want to pause there for just a moment and see if anybody has any questions on this so far, on the lookup of the option type data or anything related to that course object. All right. I'll take that as no questions then. Okay, we'll move right along to the groups data here. So groups are going to be very similar in terms of the way that they're retrieved either by ID or if you're doing all groups in a paginated way. So similarly, we've got our groups endpoint here, API v1 groups. And if I go back into my course record here, I'll go ahead and grab my group filter 1 field. I must have missed it. There it is. So I've got my group filter 1 ID, and then just applying that here. And that's going to give me the group information for that. Typically, the most important thing is the name of that group. That's what's going to appear. Again, if I go back to my course, that's what's going to appear here for the department field or the college field. It's going to use that name. But it may also be useful to look at the roles. So we've got different roles associated with the particular groups and categories or groups within categories. And then within the role instances, we have different user IDs there. So this is what we use when we're dynamically routing things through workflow to understand which users are associated with a particular department, say, or college. And so you can also use this information, you know, if you needed to report on that for some other reason, in a way that the reporting functionality within the application doesn't allow you to do. So let me just talk briefly about the group side of things. I'm going to go ahead and go out into the groups here. I'm going to go into a department. So within each of the categories here, I'm going to establish my role schema, essentially. So in this case, for departments, we've defined a committee and a chair. And so that's going to be true for all groups in this department. So if I click into, say, my chemistry department, you can see I have my committee and my chair, and then the different users associated with those roles there. So again, going back into this call, here's those user IDs. There's a user's endpoint if you needed to retrieve the user information. I'm not going to touch on that during this talk, but it is available in the API documentation. And it functions very similarly to the groups APIs as well. Within department or within groups and categories, we also have the ability to store custom fields. And so this can be, if you're looking to do some sort of integration using the APIs, this can be a really good way to store information, say, related to how a group is referenced within the student information system. We have several institutions that are doing that. So if I go back to my category here, and I view the category, I can set up custom fields as well. So I could add a field that's, say, sys department ID or something like that. And then I can go ahead and save that. And now going back to my department, for example, if I edit this, excuse me, I need to refresh. Nope. Oh, I added it to the college field. So if I go into college instead, then you see that sys department ID there, and I could add a value there. This would allow you then to store, like I said, numerical information or some sort of ID that you're using, but without necessarily having that in the name, which might confuse your end users as well. But we can store any number of fields that you might want within the category and department schema there. Okay. Similarly to options, of course, we have a paginated response. So this is going to show you in this case, we're limiting to 10. It's going to show you the first 10 groups there. And just like with options, you're going to hit the same API endpoint, whether it is a department or a college or some other type of category within the system. So I can get all groups, or I can get the specific group ID, but I don't necessarily need to know what category it's a part of. In fact, the category ID is stored directly on the group itself. Any questions on options or groups or how we reconcile that data on a course record or program record before I move on? Nope. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and talk through the process of making a course within the system using the API. So let's see. We've got a post call set up here. So following typical REST architecture, we're going to make a post call to the API CM courses endpoint. We don't have an ID, so we just hit this API CM courses endpoint because we're creating a new course. One thing to note here is if you are using an API key that is associated with a standard user, they're only going to be able to make drafts within the system. So I've set this up as a draft, even though I'm using an admin API key, but I've set this up as a draft. And there are 2 data points that are required by the API validation at minimum, and that is status and date start. Without additional configuration, you don't necessarily need anything else. Now, the additional configuration comes in when you have other fields. So for instance, we've got, I'm going to go ahead and edit this active record. And all of these fields with an asterisk next to them are going to be required. So if I go ahead and delete the department here, it's going to give me a validation error and tell me that department is mandatory. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that change, and that's going to go there. So these validation warnings are going to be enforced for everything besides drafts. However, if I make a draft without some of these things populated, it's going to throw an error when I try to submit it into workflow and say that it's required for somebody to do that. There are some other validation errors that I wanted to go over that the API will send back if you're making a request of it to make a draft and the system recognizes it as an issue. So I'm just going to go ahead and propose changes to create a new version here. And you'll notice that this particular version is going to be starting fall 2021 based on the current term within the system. If I go ahead and change this back to say fall 2019 or something like that, it's going to give me a validation warning that it's detected an overlapping version with a previous version. And the API is going to return that very same thing as well. Similarly, if I were to make a version of this, well, let me back up. It knows that it's an overlapping version because it finds a subject code and number combination for that same term. And so that's why it's going to throw that error. So I'm going to go ahead and leave edit mode there. And I'm just going to delete this proposal for now. We'll go back in here and I'm going to create a course that's going to have a couple issues with it, but it's going to go ahead and create the draft for me. So we're passing in the status, the date start, the subject code, which happens to be the chemistry subject code, and then 221. And I'm going to create it with a title Inorganic Chemistry 2 and some test text for the description. So I'll go ahead and send this. And you'll notice it gave me a 200 response. Here is the payload of the item that was created. So you'll notice the system automatically generates a created timestamp. It generates a date start label, an ID, and populates the rest of the information. It's populating the created by and updated by based on the API key that I'm using to make the request, which is again tied to my user account. Now you'll notice down here, we've got a status of failed validation. So because this is a draft, it allowed the record to be created, but it's telling me that my date start is not valid. And the date start validation, that's going to be sort of your effective term. The date start validation will give you a response indicating what are some valid dates around that. And that has to do with how you've set up your terms, which is also a configurable thing. So within the system, you can say, you could have your terms called winter, spring, summer, fall, or spring, summer, fall. And depending on how you have it configured, it's going to automatically generate the dates within the system, which it uses to do overlapping version detection. Similarly, I have a number conflict where the conflicting subject coded number has been detected. So that's my create call. If I keep sending this in, it's just going to make new courses because I'm not hitting a specific course endpoint. But if I want to instead go ahead and update a course here, I would need to, here, I'm going to go back and, yeah, I'll make a new course there. I'm going to go back and grab my ID. If I want to update that course that I just created, then I would need to do a put call, again, typical REST architecture, and hit that ID. And in this case, I'm going to fix that date start issue. I'm also going to change the number to 222. And then I'm going to add some credits information. In this case, I'm making it a range credit course that goes from 3 to 5. So I'll go ahead and send that through. That's going to go and make those updates. It's going to deliver back the entire payload of the record that I just updated. So you can see all of that data, but we only updated those fields. I'm going to go ahead and go back to curriculum management. And I'm going to go into my proposals. And I'm going to filter based on my proposals. And I'm going to look for that course that I just made. So here's the course that I just created during this demonstration. And you can see I've populated it with that chemistry subject code, the number, the title, and I've got a valid date start now, starting for spring 2022. Scrolling down here, you can see I've got my course credits here. Here's my range, 3 to 5 that I've added as well. And if I go into the audit log, one thing I wanted to make clear is that the audit log is going to capture those changes to fields that I made right in there. So that is updating a course there. Any questions on creating and updating a course or program or anything like that? Yes, James.
Hey, Eric. I was just wondering, can you create a course with any status, or can you only create drafts?
Great question. So you could create there are the different statuses that are accepted within the system are draft, active, draft, active, revision, retired, inactive. And then the system also deals with approved records. However, approved records are only system generated. So they act as your carbon copy when something is either admin approved or goes through the final approval in the record. So your ability to create, say, an active record in the system without going through the governance process means that you're going to need to be using an API key that's for an administrator. Similarly, if you're updating a record, if I have an API key that is just for a standard user, and I went in and wanted to update a course for whatever reason that's active, I wouldn't be able to do it. It would give me an unauthorized status code. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I was just thinking about the review status. Where would it put it?
Oh, and the review sorry, that's the other status. Yes.
Yeah, where would it? Can you configure where it appears in the workflow, or would it?
You would have to make additional API calls to do that. Because so the review status will indicate that it's in review, but there is a workflow ID associated with that references the workflow instance definition. And so that's what the tracker would use to be able to generate what the workflow looks like. Now, there are workflow API endpoints that we could potentially talk about to submit something into the workflow as well, if you wanted to do that. But anyway.
Cool, thanks. And just one more question, sorry.
Sure.
Can you update an approved record using the API?
You cannot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, approved records are intended to just be sort of that historical reference after something is approved. So it will give you an unauthorized error. You can update the corresponding active record, and then that will show in that record's audit log. But the approved record is unique in that it doesn't allow you to update it. And also when the approved record is generated at that final approval step, it saves the schema of the form at the time of approval. And that allows us in the interface to generate what that record looked like at the time of approval, regardless of what the current schema is.
Cool, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay. If I want to say delete a course, we issue a delete call, and just like the update, I'm going to pass in the ID, and then that's going to give me a response that it's gone. And if I go back now to my proposal list, we should no longer see Chem 222 in there, just Chem 221. This was the other one that I created earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and clean that up as well. Okay. So one related functionality that we tend to see some usage of with the API is help in automating a batch new version of courses or programs within the system. So if you have, say, some institutions will have a field on the form that indicates a certain review period or something like that. So you can use data like that to kick off a review process for any number of courses. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what that API endpoint looks like. So clicking on down here, just going to grab a sip of water. Now I'm referencing, I believe it's that same Chem 221 course. You guys are going to get sick of that course. And so in this case, we're going to be hitting a particular proposals endpoint. So the proposals endpoint is used to create a new version, just like if I'm creating a new version within the interface, and then the particular type of content, and then the ID of the record. So if I send this, it's going to go ahead and make a new version, a new draft version of the record, and it's going to return what that draft version looks like. Now you'll notice I didn't pass anything in the body here, and that's because it's going to automatically clone over all of the fields that are supposed to clone to the new version, just like it does if I'm making a new version within the interface. So I don't need to extract any information to do this. I can go ahead and make my new version. If there are automated changes that I need to make to all versions of this course or something like that, then I could go ahead and use my put call to update these particular records using the ID that gets returned in that payload, and then update those. So some people will do that as part of like a batch update type script or something like that. So if I go in here and look at this record, I'll go ahead and refresh, and it should show me that I have a current proposal or my proposal there. So here's my proposal that I just made. And you can see the system automatically changed the effective catalog year to be the very next term within the system. And all of that data has been copied over there. Now, one of the things that, that the system leverages when it's making new versions of a record is something we call PID, which I know some of you are familiar with, but I don't know if everybody is, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. So PID is short for parent ID here. And you can see every record's going to have a PID associated with it here. And so within chemistry 221, all of those records, so if I go back here, go back to my version, all of these different records are going to have the same parent ID. And that's what the system uses to know this grouping that we display here. So when you're clicking propose changes, that's one of those fields that for most form configurations will not show up on the form field here, but it does get stored on the record itself. So that parent ID is used in that way and is not something you really need to worry about if you're using this proposal endpoint, if you're creating new versions. But you can use it if you wanted to create a new course and use the same PID in a created new course to be able to link those versions together. One of the reasons we use parent ID within the system is not only to establish this linkage, but also when a course is referencing another course or a program is referencing another course, for example, we want to make a reference to that, this is going to get a little overly philosophical, but the concept of that course in time. And so we use that parent ID to say, we're linking to Chem 221, and then we use the date start and the date end of a particular record to pick the appropriate version of Chem 221 to link to. And so if I have, say, a past program or something that's referencing this particular version, it's going to link to that because, say, the program ends at spring 2020 or earlier or something like that. So we have a versions endpoint too, if you're needing to extract all different kinds of versions. This is the same endpoint, just like all of these endpoints that the system itself uses. So here we've got our API CM courses, and then we're passing in the parent ID, and then selecting the versions. So the versions are going to return a fair amount of information. It's going to return all of the different types of records associated with this parent ID. So that's going to include, going back to the question about statuses, that's going to include drafts, active versions, revisions, versions in review, and approved records as well. And so this payload can get pretty big if you're looking at a course with lots of different versions, but it's going to have all of those different versions. And again, the thing that's used by the system to detect overlapping versions is that date start and the date end attributes, which are sometimes called effective catalog year or effective term or something like that. You can label it whatever you want within the system. If you just need to know the latest active version for, say, a particular course, you can append it with this latest active, and then that will just get you the latest version of the course there. And so that's going to deliver you that single record, that single authoritative record there. Any questions on versions and parent ID and how they're used within the system? All right. Okay, I want to talk about one more endpoint before we take a break for a little bit. And that is this course dependencies endpoint here. So going into my course here, you'll notice that I have this dependencies section, which I touched on in the previous demo, and that's going to give you insight into where a particular course is used or made reference to, and potentially inform the impact of that course. So we have an endpoint for that, and again, I'm going to pull in API CM courses. I'm going to pass it my course ID, and then I'm going to specify some term information here. So this term is corresponding to a summer term date, and then I'm also including a PID there to reference. So you can see here, this is going to return now an array of data of all of the courses or programs associated with this particular course. So in this case, I've got my Chem 221 lab course and my Chem 521 and so on. And then further down, it's going to return some other different types of records, like this chemistry major is a program in this case. So we have some institutions that are using this to in addition to what the system provides at the individual record view, be able to see the most dependent upon courses or do some sort of automated QA around that process. Any questions on that? Okay. So that's the first part of this talk. When we come back, I want to talk through some specific examples using our query all endpoint that may inform some other integrations questions. Before we do that, though, when we come back, and we'll go ahead and get started back up at 10 minutes after the hour. I would love to hear from anybody that's willing to share about some of the ways you're thinking of using our APIs or other APIs for integrations at your institution, and what kind of problems they're solving, and just have a little discussion around that. And then we can talk a little bit more about the experiences endpoint as well. Sound all right? Okay, great. I'll see you all in about 7.5 minutes, it looks like. Thanks. We'll get started back here. Saw a couple questions come in. So I want to make sure to get to those. Let's see, it looks like the first one was around how to change records in the workflow within the API. Can I ask a follow-up question on that, or just to elaborate on that? Are you wanting to move things through the workflow process? Or
Yeah, hi, that was, sorry.
No
That was
problem.
my question. Yes, I've been asked to, I guess, update a bunch of versions of particular courses along the workflow. So yeah, if you don't mind doing a quick demo of that, or,
No,
or
yeah,
provide documentation, that's fine too, if we don't have time.
absolutely. So updating the data in the particular records themselves, or updating, like approving at a particular step in workflow?
To be honest, they haven't been very clear, so I would assume anything could be possible with their
Sure.
ask. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I'll go ahead and just highlight a couple things. I went over this put call. So if you were updating, say, a course in workflow, you're going to use this very same put call here, and you're just going to give it the ID of the record in review. Now, and so, if there's a particular field, you would pass that in. So, let's say my payload looks like something along the lines of automated review, and then I could put in 2021 02 22 completed, or something like that. It could be anything you want, really. But as long as you're passing in the ID of the record that's in review, and you have an API key that's going to be able to send update that record, either an admin account or one for a user that is allowed to edit at a particular point in workflow, then that edit will go through and it should be reflected in the audit log for that record. So it's just the same as updating a draft or an active record, and the limitations are only around the capability of the user account the API key is attached to.
And so I guess then I would just put a status update within the body, and that would put it through the next position within the workflow. Is that correct?
No, so that's just updating the data on the field there. So what if you wanted to send it further along in the workflow? We have specific endpoints for approvals that need to be done by the user that's approving within the record. So if you're updating data, this is the call that you would do to update data on the form. And I want to touch on one other thing related to that, but there are, let's see, if I go into the API documentation here. So this is the API endpoint that we hit for submitting a course into the workflow. If it's a draft, for example, it would be this submit for approval. And then this is the API to be able to approve. Now, again, there are limitations on this because you have to be an approver on the record in order to successfully issue this command, if that makes sense. That's part of the governance enforcement process within the software. Similarly, you can use reject, which in the interface we call deny, because it doesn't sound quite as harsh as reject, but yeah. Does that answer your question?
It does, and I guess I could be a bit more specific. There was a request to do a bunch of retirements. So I guess that's a different thing without the approval permissions, I assume.
Yeah, so well, and with any of these operations, you could, with an admin level API key, update an active record version. There's a few ways to go about it. If you were going to retire a course, for example, there is this retire endpoint, and that's going to just create a new retired version automatically. So you can do that. The other way to go about this would be to using the create a new draft version here of a course. You could create a new version, which will make a draft, and then update it with a status of retired. And then there is an admin approve endpoint that you could admin approve it that way. That's essentially what happens with this retire endpoint, but this does it sort of in one swoop, and then it doesn't reflect like an approval of it, essentially, if that makes sense.
That's great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to spend a few minutes and talk about examples where you're using APIs for integrations at your campus. It could be Koali APIs, it could be other types of APIs. Of course, I'm going to probably be able to best speak to Koali stuff, but just broadly interested in hearing what your experiences have been thus far, either using our APIs or other systems, and yeah, things like that. So I don't know if anybody wants to be extra daring and go first, but
I can share something.
Sure.
So I work at U of T, and every division is a very special, unique snowflake. So we haven't been able to use catalog because it just can't meet all of the unique requirements that they need to have. So a specific example would be engineering, where they use tables that have rules within it for the completion requirements in CM. And within these tables, they just list course codes. So one of the requirements was, well, when we publish this, we'd like to have all the courses auto-link to their course nodes and have titles added to the tables. In addition, because it's part of like, with the engineering programs, if a student is looking at a course, they want to see which programs, I guess, depend on that course. They have something historically called program tags. So they want the course nodes to all have tags obtained from these tables within CM's completion requirement. So I've had to create this really complicated bot in Python to grab all the programs from the API and then create a dictionary by scraping all the programs. So the courses have is a key to all the program tags. And then when I create the courses, they pull that information as well. So, so that's, I guess, one more complicated example, but I have found CM's API to be pretty reliable, at least like in helping me in this endeavor.
That's good to hear. And that you have my sympathies with that data operation. That sounds complicated. Anybody else want to share something?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about some of the ways we've been using the Koali APIs. One of the things we've been using is the groups and user endpoints to pull together which roles are associated with a user. So this is really useful when, say, a user at UVic changes. So like, the chair changes position, we can then find out all of the places that that user was had had some kind of role in the system. So we can then go in and change all of those instances. So that's been really useful. And it's also been useful for providing a list to a department to say, hey, these are the people we have as approvers for your department, and we can quickly generate lists with all of the roles attached. So that's really useful. Another API that I've been using recently is the audit log API. And that actually is to extract comments and approval history. So basically I can just throw a list of IDs in a spreadsheet, and then I can like look at a whole faculty worth of proposals, and I can basically get a log of all of the different comments on however many proposals I want. It's just a really useful way to be able to see that history all in one place for multiple proposals at once.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. James, I have a feeling you're going to leverage our new commenting functionality pretty heavily. That has its own set of APIs as well. So
yeah, I haven't had a chance to get in there and look at that yet. Definitely will.
Great, thanks for sharing. Anyone else like to share? All right. If anybody does want to speak up, please feel free to interrupt me, but I'll go ahead. And I wanted to just go through a few specific examples. I've got 1, 2, 3, and then we'll sort of pivot and talk a little bit more about the catalog side of things, and go from there. All right, so going into the back into my REST API client here, I think we last left off at this latest active version and dependencies. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the query all endpoint, which is typically the most heavily used endpoint for a lot of different types of integration stories, essentially. So I'm just going to pull that up here, and it happens to be this last one here. So again, like all of the endpoints that we've been talking about, it's going to have a dynamic item type and then query all. And the most common way to use this would be to pass in a query string. So in this case, I'm hitting the courses item type, and then I'm passing in a query of inorganic chemistry, and I'm going to limit the results to 10. So I'll send that through, and then it's going to deliver me an object with the number of matching results. So I've got a count of 28 matches, and then the results here. And so the results will be an array, and the value that I put in here is going to be searched across the title and the description. And it's going to, like I said, return the first 10 results. I can go ahead and skip the first 10 results and then get the next 10 there returned. So I can paginate there. Typically, most institutions will do, there's a limit on 100 in total. So typically you'll do a limit of 100 and then paginate through those as needed. But we have a number of institutions that are using this to build some data extraction tools based on a search parameter or something like that for, say, required materials or things like that. And a quick plug for later in this week, the curriculum and catalog management engineering team and I, members of that team, we'll be doing another, it's a shorter 45-minute presentation talking about some other integration stuff, and we're going to be demoing some sample integrations too, and providing like a starter integration repository as well. So that's coming Thursday afternoon. So anyway, that's the basic query all use case that most everybody has found some use for in terms of searching for a particular keyword or something like that. But there are a lot of other things that you can do with the query all endpoint. So we have some sorting capabilities. You can sort by, when something was updated or a particular field. And you can do first and second fields, for example. We already talked about limiting and skipping. And then probably the next most widely used query all parameters are the attribute and field value at query parameters. So if I go to my next query all here, this is actually a very common use case for institutions that are on some regular cadence hitting the API to review records that have been updated after a certain timestamp. So in this case, I'm saying I want only courses that have a status of active. I could change that to draft or review if I wanted to. And then I'm saying the updated should be greater than or equal to, that's my greater than or equal to operator there. And then we pass in this big number, which is the Unix epoch in milliseconds from 1970, and JavaScript applications in general just expect milliseconds, not seconds. So that's why we have that there. And then again, I'm passing in a limit. So just going back to the documentation here, we're using the attribute and then the value. And then this is where that greater than or equal to parameter comes in. So I'll just go ahead and go back to this and publish or send that along. And so now I can see this timestamp happens to be, I think it was February 1st I put in there. And so this will show me all of the different courses that have been updated. And so the most common use case for this is I have some system downstream that regularly needs to know about changes to active courses, and then I can go ahead and run my updates based on what's being stored in curriculum management. We have some institutions that are doing this, say, nightly, sometimes more frequently than that. A lot of institutions do like a weekly cadence as well, to be able to extract that, and using that updated timestamp really allows you to limit the amount of data that you'd need to process with something like that in a batch script like that. Now, one of the things about this particular payload is you'll notice it's like many of the endpoints, it's returning everything in the API, or it's returning everything associated with these records. And so sometimes you may want to only have, say, maybe all you care about is the title field, or all you care about is required resources or something like that. And so in the query all documentation, here's that same query, but I'm specifying only the fields I want. So I'm going to give it a title, and then I want to look at, in this case, what the requisites text are. So so this is stored within a meta attribute. And the requisites text is the generated text from the rules gadget interface when you're setting up those requirements. So each rules instance of a rules gadget is going to have a cached text version that can be referenced as well. So if I send this through, you'll see we're still getting 22 objects, 22 results there, but we're only returning the title and the requisites text. So this payload is much smaller. And if you're dealing with 1,000 courses or something like that, that can really reduce the amount of time it takes for the script to run and also give our API a little bit of a break. Yeah, so you can reference these sub properties, and this is the way you would do that. So you've got meta.requisites text there, and then that's going to return that. If I wanted to include, say, credits, I can just simply add that to that parameter there and run this again, and now it's going to include the credits field data as well. Any questions on that before I go through my third example?
Hey, Eric.
Yes.
So basically your greater than kind of check, it's just checking if there's any change to the record. You can't query based on, a specific field changing. Is that right?
That's you can do that in the reporting interface for a specific field. But yes, the updated timestamp is anything on the record has changed.
Okay, thanks.
All right, just wanted to go through one final example here before we move on to the catalog side of things. So in this example, again, we're using that query all endpoint here. I'm getting active courses, but in this particular case, this was something that I came across with an institution that was doing an audit of courses that had a range of credits that had a max of 5 credits, which was an anomaly at this particular institution. And so in this case, that credits data, as you may recall, is stored, it's sort of like a nested object in there. And so in this particular parameter, we're saying the status is active, the credits chosen value is range, and then the credits max value is 5. Again, I'm going to limit it to 10 here. And so this is showing me now that I have 51 courses within the system. Again, I'm getting all of the fields here, but just to highlight, we're able to query down to that sub parameter there, or these sub attributes there, and be able to see all of the courses that match that criteria. So we've and again, this is something that you can also do in reporting, but if you have some automated processes where a script can be a handy tool, that's certainly available to you within the API. Are there any other examples that you all would like to talk through that I might be able to help with? I just put together these 3 for some general purpose ones, some common kinds of things we see, but I'd love to hear if you have any specific questions that I might be able to address. If not, that's okay too. And we're always, of course, happy to hear from you if you have specific questions about your particular institution. Okay. I wanted to spend some time talking about the catalog side of things, which I think for some of you will be a little bit of a review, but talk about some of the things to consider when you're working through the catalog and building out your catalog. So first of all, we've designed our catalog to really have a nice, tight, seamless integration between curriculum management. And as many of you know, we want to be able to capture all of the data you're looking for and manage that process so that when it comes time to creating the catalog, we can do that sort of automatically by specifying a date range and generating that catalog. And then you can go ahead and get that embedded on your website. Our approach to embedding the catalog is one that we think makes it easy to be able to use within any CMS where you can copy and paste HTML and JavaScript. And so it really gives most institutions a lot of flexibility in where they want certain catalogs. And recently, well, I guess it's not super recent, but fairly recently, we released functionality to be able to generate multiple types of catalogs so that you can create, say, an undergraduate or graduate catalog. We have some institutions that are doing on-campus and remote instruction catalogs and things like that. And we've designed it so that you can really leverage just about any attribute that you're storing on the curriculum management side and be able to generate a catalog with only records that are specific to that audience. And above all, we want to keep this as simple as possible. And that includes when it comes time to launch your catalog. So there's obviously a lot of complexity that comes with a lot of the form configuration and workflow configuration stuff that we've been talking about. But when it comes time to make that catalog and making it live on your website, we really want to make that as simple as possible. So our developer documentation, we've been spending the bulk of our time here talking about curriculum management's developer documentation. And as you've seen, it's quite extensive. It's very powerful. As a contrast, the catalog documentation is pretty concise. And that's because there's just not, there's not a whole lot to getting a catalog live on your website. So I just wanted to go through a few specifics here, and then I think we'll have plenty of time for additional questions, or we'll end a little bit early and give you back a little bit more of your day. So looking at this complete example, this is obviously a super simple, not realistic HTML page, but it has everything that you need to be able to embed the catalog on your website. So starting with in the header, we would have these two lines here. This first line is just to ensure that the website's going to be responsive. The quality catalog is, of course, responsive if you're on a mobile phone or tablet or something like that. And then we have our link to our style sheet, which is just the base styles of the catalog there. And then all you need is this one div here with an ID of quality catalog. And then down before you get to the closing body tag, you're going to add these script tags with the window subdomain, and then indicating your particular instance. So if I was going to embed this particular catalog here, that I have in my instance, I would give it this subdomain of KCM cat demo, and then you can specify, and we recommend as a best practice, specifying a catalog ID, and that's going to allow you to specifically render a specific catalog. I'll get into that a little bit further in just a moment. And then finally, we have our JavaScript reference, which is the whole thing that renders the catalog there. Once that loads, that's going to render on the page there. So I just want to go over a quick example that we have here. So here's our sample catalog. And I'm going to pull this up just to show this here. So this is a sample page that we've created just to demonstrate, how it embeds. Of course, on the catalog side, you're going to be creating your pages and deciding what content from courses is coming over and whatnot. So if I click into my courses within the interface itself, nothing to do with the API, you're going to be deciding, if I go to my, my course here, you're going to be deciding exactly which information is going to be coming over from curriculum management. There's nothing extra you need to do in order to publish that. But if I go into the main area here, you'll see we've got it sort of nested in here. And here's that HTML that I've added. You'll notice that it sits below the header. So this header would be something that that your institution has on their website style guide. Same thing with the footer down here. So that's going to, of course, be something that's managed directly on your website. And the idea is really that we don't want you to have to rebuild your website in two places. We want to sort of put the catalog in and be able to adopt consistent headers and footers and things like that on your website. So we've got that in there, and once that JavaScript file loads up, it's going to do all of this rendering in the background. There's really nothing else that you need to do in order to render the catalog. So that is just a quick overview of the process of the catalog side. Are there any questions on that before I go over some best practices with catalog embedding? Okay. So one thing that we do deal with from time to time related to having an embedded catalog is because this is actually getting rendered inside your website. There are some things that the catalog is going to adopt in terms of styling within the embedded page. So within the catalog product, I'll just show you. I'm going to go over there. Within the catalog product, you're able to set some theme settings here, which allow you to set the font. We're able to use native Google fonts from the Google Fonts library. And then you can set, of course, your font color, link color, and primary color. And as of right now, all of the other styles are essentially baked into the catalog. However, there are some things that will carry over depending on how specific your CSS is written on your website. So for instance, we have some institutions that have a default table style or a default list style or something like that. And those are, if they're just targeting like a table element, for example, those are just going to typically carry through on the catalog with nothing additional that's needed there. Our styles tend to be fairly generic and up to date with current trends with table styles and other elements, things like that. But if you have specific ones at your institutions, those styles are typically going to carry through as long as they aren't too specific to a particular class or attribute or something like that. So that's one thing that we see. Another thing that we sometimes see is that the element where the catalog is being embedded oftentimes has some additional margin or padding settings, which can you can run into some issues with the layout sometimes with that. But generally speaking, the catalog will adapt to the width that it's put into, and Occupy, you're sort of seeing the maximum width into that centralized column there. Yeah, so those are some of the best practices that I wanted to go over with you. Are there any questions before we wrap up this session around the curriculum management side of things or the catalog side of things that I might be able to answer while I have you? All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this presentation and walking through these things and sharing your examples and questions and whatnot. I very much appreciate it. I hope it's been helpful and informative. Reminder that you can rate the session and give me and others feedback as we go throughout, and certainly if you have questions, I'm available in the Socio app, and I'd be happy to touch base this week or sometime in the future if you'd like. And yeah, we're happy to have you here and appreciate your time. Another reminder, we are running a contest. If you scan this QR code and tell us what you'd like to automate using one of our products, Build, which is a general purpose forms and workflow automation tool. Yeah, we love to hear ideas, and we'll be picking a winner at the end of the conference, which this year does span several weeks, with it being remote and across several different business lines for Quali. So encourage you to participate in that. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.